Hey guys, today I'm talking about growing giant hostas, and this one is quite large. I've actually had to prune it back because it started to grow into my sidewalk here, and I would either have to move the entire pot, which I really don't want to do, or I had to prune it back. So I've pruned back some of the leaves on it. But as you can see, hostas come in all sizes. This is a miniature hosta, basically just handheld size. And this is a giant Empress Wu hosta. It gets quite a bit larger actually than this, and the pot that it sits in is quite large. But even this pot could probably be upsized to increase the size, and there probably will be some dividing done this not this year, but maybe next year. I'll do some dividing to replicate this hosta so I can go from one giant hosta like this to having two, and they do grow quite fast. So I'm going to show you how to maximize the speed of getting your hostas really big, and I'll show you a couple of other examples of large hostas on the other area of my yard. But these are one of my favorite potted plants as they come back a little better each year as long as you give them the proper care. And I'm going to give you 25 steps on exactly how to maximize their size and keep them really healthy. Now, as you can see, hostas come in a variety of sizes, and these hostas have been growing in these pots for quite a number of years. And believe it or not, these hostas all started as about 1 gallon sizes, so they're quite a bit older than they probably look because I have not upsized the pots fast enough to maximize the size. But anyways, pot size is extremely important in maximizing the size of your hosta because you want them to have adequate root area so they can grow and expand their root system, which in turn expands the leaf size or the overall plant size. Now, as you can see, these hostas get really big. This one is in one of the largest pots I have. It's in a very nice ceramic pot, and even this pot is starting to begin to get a little bit small. So if you want giant hostas, you need to go for varieties that will get truly large. So the 3 hostas that get really big are Gentle Giant, Empress Wu, and Sum and Substance. Those 3 get really big, such as this one. Now, if you want them to be the really large size like this, you're going to have to really be willing to put a lot of effort into growing them properly. So let's head back to the greenhouse and we'll go through 25 steps on how to maximize their size. So the most important thing if you're wanting to grow a giant hosta is the variety selection. Now, this hosta right here is a miniature. It is, believe it or not, this hosta is over 15 years old, and it will never get any bigger than this. It might slowly spread a little bit. I could divide it and turn it into 2 plants. But just remember, the 3 largest hostas I mentioned earlier, Empress Wu, Sum and Substance, and Gentle Giant, those are the hostas that will get truly huge. We're talking in some cases 6 foot tall and 6 foot wide if they're planted in the optimum condition with the optimum fertilizer, soil, everything has to be perfect. But you can have hostas that are extremely beautiful and extremely large even if the growing area that you live in is not ideal. But in wintertime, these hostas will die back, but they'll come back a little better every year. So even in the coldest of winters, I've never had to bring them in the greenhouse. I just leave them outside and they come back just fine in the springtime. Now, the perfect time to plant hostas is in spring or fall when there's more moisture in the ground and there's a better chance of that hosta getting established. Planting in July, August can sometimes put too much stress on the plant. So just remember, you want to do this not early spring, but probably mid to late spring to have the optimum time to grow all summer long. If you're at the end of the season and you see a hosta at your big box store, then still October is still a good time to plant unless you get really cold weather early on. So just remember, as soon as frost hits it, you're going to see wilting and dieback, and the hosta will not survive its leaf form like this. It will completely die back to the ground. But again, the root system will survive. So I may have said that incorrectly. It will survive freezing temperatures at the root level, but not in the leaf section. So it will die back. And in the spring, as soon as the temperatures warm up, you'll start to see buds coming out. I'll put a picture right here that shows you what it looks like when the hostas start coming back out of the ground if you've never grown hostas before. Now, since this video is specifically about growing giant hostas and getting them to the largest size possible in the shortest amount of time, you want to remember that these hostas need a lot of room to grow. I personally prefer to grow hostas in containers rather than the ground because there are some pests like slugs and snails that will get on the hostas and eat holes in the leaves, and it's a lot more difficult when you have a large planter, and that really helps. You can put things out that will deter them, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But just remember that if you have it in a container, I think it personally will look better and it will look even taller than it naturally will. Let's say you have a 3.5, 4 foot hosta and you have 2 feet below it inside of a container. your hosta truly looks massive in size. Now, if you opt for planting your hosta in the ground, you want to remember these hostas, the giant hostas, are going to get truly huge. So you want to have them spaced 3 feet apart so they have room to expand. And that's really important because if the hostas grow together, they're going to rob sunlight from each other and they're not going to be at their optimum size and optimum health. Now, another thing to remember, whether you're planting in the ground or in a pot, you want that soil to be really rich in organic matter. And 2 of the ingredients I always add to the soil that I'm already using is I use a good quality potting soil, and I'll show you how to make it. I'll put a link to a video right up here, but also I add extra black cow composted manure. It won't burn the hosta because it's been well aged. And also I add coconut coir. You need to, if you buy a block of this, you'll need to break it up and soak it in water and let it absorb that because this black form is extremely dry. So just remember coconut coir, black cow, and the really rich potting soil. And I've got, like I said, that video will help you, show you how to make it yourself and save a lot of money, especially if you're buying some of the more expensive, well-known brands. It's extremely expensive nowadays to buy your own potting soil over making it yourself. So I opt to go with that first option. Now these small miniature hostas, I have them under shade fabric that's 90% shade, and I don't want them to get too much sun because they can get leaf scorch. And that's true even in some of the giant varieties. If you have a giant hosta that's in all day full sun, you can get leaf scorch on the leaves. So my hostas do get some sun, morning sun, and some early afternoon sun, but as the sun goes over the trees, they get some nice shade in the afternoon. So just remember, you want to avoid putting them in full sun. Even the varieties that say they can tolerate that, if you're in a zone like me, zone 7A, you can get leaf scorch very quickly and easily in the months of July, August, and September. So you just want to make sure that they do have some afternoon shade and preferably only morning sun. Now, when it comes to giant hostas, you want to do proper watering, and that means keeping the soil consistently moist, not waterlogged, but consistently moist. And this is the key. This is the key to my entire watering system when it comes to my larger hostas, and that's micro irrigation. I'll put a video link here that shows you exactly how to set one of these up, and I'll put links in the description on where you can buy some of these things. If either Amazon or some of the other places I buy, I have some individual websites, but I'm not sure if they're still in business. It's been so long. I ordered quite a few of these, so I'll have a very long-lasting supply. So I know Amazon still carries these, and I believe eBay does, but these are micro emitters for a drip irrigation system, and you can adjust the tops of them. You can put a lot of water in the hotter months where you have a chance of the soil drying out and cut it down back when you get to October, November, and then completely shut it off during the winter months when you don't need to water. So that's one thing to remember, is proper watering will encourage deeper root growth, and keeping the soil consistently moist will keep your hosta very healthy, happy, and going to that giant state of size. Now, mulching is an extremely important thing to do on giant hostas. Again, whether they're in the ground or in a large pot, you want to make sure you mulch really heavily. I usually mulch at least 2 inches of very finely shredded pine bark, and that's called soil conditioner, and it's sold at Lowe's. You might be able to find it at your local garden supply, but it's not your standard shredded pine bark. It's a very finely shredded pine bark. And I do something a little unusual, as I put a layer, a very thin layer, maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick, of pea gravel on top of the mulch that helps retain that moisture and keeps the neighborhood cats from digging around in the hosta, but it also reflects a little bit of that sunlight, stabilizing the soil temperature. Now, I use a couple of different types of fertilizer. I use a balanced 10-10-10 slow release pelletized fertilizer just for the general fertilization, but if I really want to encourage root growth, I go with Schultz Bloom Booster. Now, hostas do create flowers, not a lot, but they'll send out 1, 2, maybe 3 flowers on a large plant. But the reason I'm using the Schultz Bloom Booster is that it has a very, very high phosphorus count, 10, 52, 14, 13, something like that. But that middle number is what encourages root growth. So Schultz Bloom Booster, it's a little hard to find. I haven't been able to find it at Walmart. I usually just buy it online and have it shipped to me. But it is a water-soluble fertilizer. Now, if you don't want to use that, you could use bone meal, but you're not going to get that extremely high phosphorus count unless you're using a ton of bone meal. So either way, if you want to go the organic route, bone meal or Schultz. But I think that will really help encourage root growth and overall size of your giant hostas. Now, one of the worst pests you can have in your garden for hostas are slugs and snails, because they'll eat a lot of holes, they'll be able to get to the plant, and they can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time. So I've got a video where I talk about how to get rid of those, and I'll link that up above. Just remember that it goes back to why I like planting in pots is because it's a little bit harder for those slugs and snails to get to them. And you can also put a humidity tray at the base of those large plants, which is another layer of protection for your hosta from those slugs and snails. Now, these miniature hostas could be divided. It's not really necessary because I don't want these to get gigantic. They're not going to get gigantic because they're miniature hostas. But on the giant hostas, you will need to divide them every 3 to 5 years to prevent overcrowding of the root system in those large pots, which can allow them to reach their maximum size. So just remember, about every 3 to 5 years, you want to take a look, maybe even pull them out of the pot in the wintertime and see how densely packed the root system is inside the pot, because if it looks crowded, it probably is. And if it's been 3 years, you probably need to divide it. I'll put a video right here that shows you how to separate, divide hostas. I have new hostas this year that I've planted that I just started last year from dividing the hostas, and it works great. It's a way to get free hostas forever. Now, there is a possibility of getting fungal diseases in hostas if you crowd them in and plant them too close to each other and you don't have adequate airflow. And that's the key to dividing them a little bit away from each other and allowing that airflow to circulate within the plants. Funguses can grow in those kind of conditions, especially if you're in zone 7A like me, where you have a lot of humidity in the summer, and funguses, bacteria, things like that grow extremely well in a high humidity environment. Now, another way of growing hostas, if you don't want to put them in pots, is to use raised beds, where there's wooden raised beds, metallic raised beds, or even a very beautiful stone raised beds, which I do have some of the stones you buy at the big box store, and you can raise up a bed and put in some really good quality soil. As I mentioned before, I can make a lot of my own for a lot cheaper than I can buy it. So you just want to remember that good drainage is really important with these large hostas, these giant hostas, because you can have issues with root rot. Now, rabbits and deer can do a lot of damage to hostas because they'll eat the foliage. So just remember that you want to provide some type of protection. If you don't use netting, you'll want to use something like a cayenne pepper. You can mix it up in a hose-in sprayer, and occasionally, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, spray it with a solution of just a little bit of soap to keep the formula to sticking to the leaves. And the rabbits and deer will avoid it if you use this powdered cayenne pepper. You can buy this in a larger size. I'll put a link to it in the description as well. Other than that, if you don't have any of this or don't want to take the time to spray them, or if you don't have the time, you can use something like Snake Away. It's a sulfur, very strong smelling sulfur product. You can buy at the big box stores, Walmart, online. I'll put a link to that as well. But you can buy that, sprinkle it around the base of your hostas, and its smell is terrible. Of course, you don't want to do that if it's in a seating area where you're close to your garden and you spend a lot of time out there. The smell can be a little bit overwhelming. But if you're just wanting to protect them out away from the house, the Snake Away is great. And also you could use mothballs, just sprinkle that around the base of the plant, and the smell of that can repel the deer and rabbits away. Now, one thing I often talk about is using a pH and a soil meter, and that's really good to have around your hostas, because hostas like it to be a little bit on the acidic side to the neutral side. And having a pH tester, a soil moisture meter, that really helps you with a lot of plants across your entire garden. So I'll put a link to one of those as well. But making sure make sure your soil has the exact proper pH level, because if you're too alkaline, your hostas, where's my voice today? Your hostas may have issues with growth because the soil conditions are not just right for them. Now, many years ago, I had some hostas planted right outside a back door area that had a lot of foot traffic, and you want to make sure that you plant hostas away from where you have a lot of foot traffic from humans or animals, especially dogs, because they do have a little bit brittle stems, and a dog going through a hosta patch will break the stems off and they'll do a lot of damage to them. So just remember, you want to put them in an area that doesn't have a lot of foot traffic, human or animal. Now, because my property is so large, a leaf blower is an absolute essential thing that I have to have around the garden. But when I'm blowing leaves, dust stirs up and it often lands on the leaves. So you want to make sure that you mist spray your hostas. You don't want to do it with the jet or shower. You want to do it with a very gentle mist and just rinse the leaves off to allow them to have proper photosynthesis to allow the plant to grow properly. So just remember, a hosta with a lot of dust on it is going to have issues. And so just doing it with a light, gentle misting water will really help it if you do that just once a week. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the video, you can prune hostas, the individual leaves. You don't want to prune the whole thing because that would probably kill it, or at least it would heavily damage it. So just remember, It can take light pruning, a stem here and a stem there. In my case, it was blocking a sidewalk, and I had to prune it back just a little bit off one side. So pruning is a good idea, especially if you have some dead or dying leaves. You can prune it without having to worry about it damaging the hosta itself. Now, one of the great plants that I like planting with my hostas is astables, which usually require about the same moisture requirements, so I can plant those in a large container and they really look good together. Now, I do use some, just like I said earlier, the standard mulch around the plant. But if we're expecting a really, really cold winter, I'll take some pine straw and cover it up to a foot, and I might actually surround the pot, the planting container, with a huge amount of pine straw if we're expecting that kind of cold, cold winter, which we don't have those very often, maybe once every 5 to 10 years. But if you live in a more northern climate, you definitely want to protect it with an extra layer, maybe up to a foot of pine straw once it's died back down to the ground. Now, I mentioned earlier about this is the key to my entire watering system, but I do occasionally come back and water extra. But when you're watering, you don't want to water overhead. You want to water right at the base of the plant to help, again, prevent those fungal diseases from popping up. So just remember, if you don't have an irrigation system and you're just doing manual watering, make sure you water only at the base, and that will help cut back on any possible fungal diseases, especially in the hot, humid summers. Now, of course, you want to monitor your large hostas for any possible diseases. If you see yellowing of the leaves, holes in the leaves, drooping of the leaves, you could have a disease already started. And one of the things that I like to use as kind of an old homemade remedy is taking a shot glass per gallon of water and watering it with that shot glass with Listerine. I need to clarify that. Shot glass and Listerine in the water, and maybe just a few drops of a Dawn dish soap, and that can really help clear up some of those diseases that might be in the soil. Now, this is a Japanese hori-hori knife, and it's really one of the things I use in the garden quite a bit. But in this case, with hostas, I'll take this and stab around the soil to aerate the root system. There's actually a couple things we're doing when we do that. We're actually doing some root pruning, which helps. Pruning normally always helps stimulate growth. But when we're doing this, we're aerating and pruning the roots to help the roots be healthier overall. So taking this and just gently stabbing it into your pot or around your hosta. Don't go crazy. Don't do a psycho type of stabbing, but just about 3 or 4 or 5, maybe once a month during the growing season. That can help aerate the soil. It also allows water to penetrate deeper if the top of your soil has dried out and has become hydrophobic. Now, another thing that can help your hostas absorb nutrients better, especially if they're inside of large containers, is using a micro rhizobial tonic, and I'll put a link to one of these down in the description as well. But this helps the hosta absorb nutrients and keeps it a little bit healthier. I know I butchered that pronunciation, but I've never been able to say that word, even though I've been using this for many, many years around my hosta, around my bonsai. So just remember, I'll put a link to that in the description. Now, sometimes these giant hostas, their leaves can become so heavy that they need a little bit of support to keep them from drooping over. So just remember that early in the season, just as they're starting to come out of the ground, adding something like this to the area around the ground or inside the pot can help add a little bit of added support. Just remember, you want to make sure it's a proper diameter. If you have a really giant hosta, this would probably confine it. So just remember, this can add extra support if your hosta is truly becoming a giant. So what got me to thinking about these giant hostas is I did some division last fall, which is just separating the hostas and duplicating them so you can get free plants. And that's what I love about hostas. They come back I told my wife this all the time, they come back a little bit better every year. Some of the hostas I have are about to exceed 20 years in lifespan, and they've only gotten better every year. The only problem I've had is what I spoke about earlier about too much traffic from animals, that they were damaged. But other than that, the hostas have performed really well. Once I started putting them in pots, I had almost zero problem with slugs and snails. Remember, keeping them watered properly is another really important thing. You don't want the soil to dry out. You'll quickly have a problem with your hosta, whether it's through disease, wilting, or just overall damage. When a plant becomes weak, that is when it's more susceptible from attack from diseases, funguses, bacteria, and pests. So just remember, you want to keep that soil perfectly moist, and you can do that with a soil pH meter. So guys, I hope you'll consider growing some of these giant hostas. They truly are beautiful. Unfortunately, I had to come inside or I would have showed you a few more in the yard, but we're having some rain today. So anyways, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.